Kia ora koutou. Kia ora koutou I hoa ma. Kia ora koutou I aku rangatira. Haere mai nā manahiri. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Mea noi tātou. Let's pray. I te atua, mana ki tia mātou, I tēnei ahi, mō e mātou whai whakaro katoa, ka hure tēnei wā kia koe. Amene. God bless us this evening in our reflection and our thinking. We turn everything over to you. Amen. Nō mai, haere mai, ki te whare wananga o nā toa whakaora, haere mai ki Thought Matters. Nā mihi nui ki a koutou katoa. He mihi mahana tēnei ki tō mātou a kakero I tēnei pau, nō mai I Major David Noakes. He mihi whakawhetai, mō tā koe mahi rangatira. Komeo toku in oa. As early as 1987, Jock Phillips, in A Man's Country, the image of the Pākehā male, cautioned that the bloke, that stereotypical image of what it had been, at least in New Zealand, to be male, had come under siege. And he noted, and it's careful, you've got to note how he notes this. We must consider the personal cost of the male stereotype to thousands of New Zealand men. He didn't include the cost to women and children. But it's important to add that. The cost to men, women and children afraid to leave the role which they had been trained for since the cradle and lacking other models that might have been more fulfilling. 1987, 3 decades later, we have this. In combating something of a global stereotype of what it means to be a man, the founder of the Me Too movement, Tēnā Burke, she lamented in 2008 in an article in the Guardian that the campaign that she started against sexual violence had become unrecognisable and misrepresented as a vindictive plot against men. Tēnā Burke started the campaign in 2006 with the goal of providing support to survivors of sexual violence in her community. The phrase took off globally, and we know this, in the wake of the allegations against the Hollywood mogul Harvey Weinstein. My vision, says Burke, for the Me Too movement is part of a collective vision to see a world free of sexual violence. I believe we can build that world, full stop. To help you and I grapple with what it now means to be a man, including the part that men can play, should play, have to play in building a world free of the stereotypes that lead to sexual violence, a world where both men and women have the freedom to flourish. We're excited to have the man, Major David Noakes, with us tonight. David Noakes has a Master's in Religious Studies from Victoria University, currently a senior tutor at Booth College of Mission, lecturing in spiritual formation, New Testament and biblical theology, and reminded me tonight, I have no idea why, that he is married and in love to Major Vivian Noakes. Amen. Please join me in welcoming Major Noakes tonight.
Thank you, Malcolm, and I want to start tonight by, this is not me really using a data projector, but I want to start with uncertainty and disease. I feel very uncertain tonight and very much ill at ease, because when Vivian found out I was doing this topic, she said, "What? What?" And I know that the rhetoric is going to be matched afterwards to the actual behaviour of this particular male, and I'm not looking forward to that. But hopefully by saying that already tonight I've disarmed her somewhat. We will see. Yeah. We live in hope. So uncertainty and dis-ease. I'd like to suggest tonight that the Me Too movement is merely symptomatic of something which has been going on for a long while. And people like Weinstein represents a minority, the few, who have created chaos, actually, within the world of men. And this group of few people, a few men, and the church has had them too, of course, has created this environment of uncertainty and disease. And I call it the sabotage by the few, really. Their behaviours have just not with the Me Too movement, but for a long, long while, men's behaviours of the few have created a very, very difficult environment. And I'd like to give you a couple of personal examples. When I left varsity many, many years ago to go teaching, I decided I would teach new entrants, 5-year-olds. And one of my motivations for that was so that, there are two motivations. Firstly, I was hopeless at maths and I could cope with 5-year-old maths. But the second reason was even then, 1 in 3 children didn't have a father in the home. And I thought it was important that actually they had a male role figure within their lives. I don't think I'd do that now. If I had the chance to repeat, I don't think I'd teach new entrants again. And I think the men here will know why. It's just too difficult. Although here at Empty Care at college we do have a male staff member, David, and I admire him for actually doing that. It comes down also to the environment, which now means that I won't bath my grandchildren. I won't. Now, what kind of environment is that? Where I feel that uncertain and that much disease that as a male, well into his 60s, won't actually do that. And so it's been the sabotage by the few. And with the raft of measures which have taken place to ensure safety and health and safety and boundaries and also sometimes the false accusations which have also taken place, men are feeling very, very uncertain, I'd like to propose tonight. So let's have a look at some of the sources of this uncertainty, and this is going to create a ripple immediately. Firstly, equality for women. Now, I'm not arguing for one moment that we should not be striving for equality for women. Not for one moment. But there are 2 women commentators who have made an important observation. One is Celia Lashley, who died not that long ago, and New Zealand lost a remarkable woman when we lost Celia. She was a remarkable lady. And please read He'll Be Okay, Growing Gorgeous Kids into Good Men, which is her book. She wrote, "Woman's quest for freedom has perhaps taken its toll on our perception of men and manhood." And then Gail Sheehy, who's actually American, I've got to state, not a New Zealander, in her book Understanding Men's Passages, and I reckon in that one as well, wrote, "Women are developing a new belief system. A new way of life is coalescing. Most men don't know what's happening to them. They don't have any idea what to believe in. For a lot of us, the values we grew up with have been subverted and changed. Men are astonished at this change. They haven't formulated a response to it. It's a time when men are very, very uncertain." So that maybe is one of the first sources of uncertainty, that in the striving to bring equality for women, that in fact it's had an unintended consequence for men in the process. Secondly, is the impact of the Industrial Revolution as being one of the sources of uncertainty. When industrialists realised that if they created time, they could also create money, it resulted in a big change in the world of men. Men up until that point of time were usually based on the land, and their sons would go out with them and learn how to till the land. That's a broad generalisation, but you know what I mean. Girls, of course, would stay home and learn what mum had to teach them. But the Industrial Revolution changed that dynamic. I'm not suggesting for a moment we should go back to that old dynamic, But what has happened is that the man has been removed from the family unit and would have to go and work for long hours and come home tired and often very angry because of what he's had to do to keep the family afloat. The removal of the male from the family unit, leaving, of course, boys without that role modelling, if you like, without that example. It wasn't so bad for girls, but for boys it was. And it was Langwood who observed that industrialisation brought a significant decline in the authority and responsibility of the father. So there's been significant social change in the Western world, and of course going on in other parts of the world now as well. Thirdly, another factor have been different understandings and arguments over what a man is. Firstly is the essentialist argument. That's a biological argument. A man is born a man. The genes and everything else determine exactly what you're going to be. As against the cultural construct, which says, well, no, children develop and grow according to their environment and what they're taught to actually, how they're taught to respond to that actual environment. This is the gender versus sexuality argument. And Clatterboard identified 6 key men's movements in the book Redeeming Men, Religion and Masculinities. He spoke firstly of the conservative movement, conservatism, where biology dictates men's role as the provider and protector of a nuclear family. The conservative argument. The pro-feminist argument, however, points to the negative impacts of the conservative view, and that men are not essentialist, they can be transformed. As against the men's rights movement, which focuses on social, legal and political realities that put men at a disadvantage. That's the kind of argument that it's always the woman, the mother, who gains custody of the children. That kind of argument, that kind of leaning. He also identified the men's spiritual movement with weekend retreats, sweat lodges, drumming schools. Imagine that, men going away for a weekend and drumming on drums. Sounds exciting, we must do that here. And storytelling. Men's spiritual movement. As against the socialist argument, which sees gender as a social construct and the problems of masculinity as the product of economic relations. And then finally you have the male-specific movements, for example, the needs of Jewish men in various countries overseas, and of course now the gay movement as well. There's a further possible source of the uncertainties as well. And this is what Jock Phillips refers to in his well-researched book, which Malcolm's just quoted from. And I call them the evolutionary factors in the emergence of the Kiwi bloke. Now, Jock Phillips points out that in 1861, he actually argues that in the 19th century, New Zealand had a very rich male culture. It was a single male culture on the whole. Well, not on the whole, but it was a very powerful single male culture. And the reason for this was because in 1861, for example, there were 622 women for every 1,000 men in New Zealand. Now, just think about that. My maternal grandparents, Grandad Price, was 12 years older than my grandmother. All right? So men married later, and the woman tended to be younger very often. And some of you might be able to reflect back on your own histories to remember that. Phillips points out that men were based in the rural areas. They were involved in the development of New Zealand, forestry, roads, railways, etc., farming, that they were hard workers. These were the guys who could do anything with a number 8 piece of wire. Mateship was very, very important, and yarns and gambling and drinking and binging and physical prowess. These were the things which marked the single male culture. And when these guys arrived in town for Saturday and Sunday with all this money in their pockets, because the men tend to be better paid than in other parts of the world, they of course created a lot of havoc. The townies and the women, of course, began to react against this, and especially with the temperance movement And I guess we could also say that the women's franchise movement as well reacted against this. And so the emphasis in government was to actually get these blokes married, get them married and get them settled down. And various pieces of legislation were introduced to try and enable this settling down. The TAB, the Totalisator Agency Board, was introduced to control gambling. Laws about prostitution, of course, were implemented. 6 o'clock closing. I can remember 6 o'clock closing. I can remember sneaking into the pub at 16 years of age, more than once, with 6 o'clock closing. But of course that resulted in men returning home when 6 o'clock fell, heavily inebriated and often violent and everything else. And so men learnt that by the way, that world of the single male still carried on. We can see that in some of the beer advertising even to this day. It carried on also, of course, with men in the two world wars. It carried on particularly within the whole sphere of the rugby field as well. This kind of single male outlook still carried on, even although the compliant family man was kind of the goal which was being trying to be achieved. So men, in fact, found themselves in two worlds. There was the world of men and of mateship and of rugby and so forth, and then there's the world of the loyal family man and the world of woman as well. And a lot of men cope with this with humour, some with resignation, some with resentment, says Jock Phillips, and some with violence. So now we come into the 60s and the 70s and onwards, and what do we have? Well, actually, we don't have any characteristic male. I don't think it's possible to actually speak in New Zealand of the typical Kiwi bloke. There's been all sorts of things which have been introduced. Snags, you know what a snag is? A sensitive, new age guy has emerged on the scene. So has the metrosexual. I read that in Australian men at one point, 44% of Australian men were using face wash, 45% were using moisturiser, and 33% owned a pink set of clothing of one kind or another. The metrosexual. Menopause. We'll talk about menopause later on. Not menopause, menopause. A cave-in of sexual confidence in middle-aged men. Oh, dear, oh dear. Bromance, okay. Now, this doesn't have any connotations in a sexual way, but it's like woman-type friendships. Well, men are finding those kinds of friendships as well. Usually not with older men than themselves, but men of the same age. So, some of the factors which have contributed to this uncertainty and this disease within men. But I'd like to propose tonight that there is no longer any such thing as a typical Kiwi bloke. Not really. You've got all sorts of little groupings, I guess, of all kinds, but there's no such thing as an overriding typical Kiwi bloke. So, let's move on. What does this uncertainty look like? Steve Smith, again another author in this particular area, says that men are less successful in health, in safety, in shelter, and in love. They die earlier, and we know that, same in New Zealand. The possibility of suicide is 3 times greater. They're more lonely, more vulnerable, and are more likely to be homeless. And Smith talks about the fact that men possess something called toxic masculinity. In other words, the use of threat power to control others through unpleasant consequences rather. And he also talks about stressed masculinity, culturally sanctioned emphasis on toughness, aggressiveness, bravery, and something else I can't read. John Eldridge, my printing, I'm really up with the play, I'm a real New Age guy. John Eldridge, who comes from a strong, he's a Christian writer, but comes from a strong essentialist point of view, really. In the book Wild at Heart, speaks of the simmering heart of a man and refers to men's sullenness, their inability to share, that the fact that they're unable to express emotion, emotionally isolated, angry. If they're lost in anything, it's lost in their careers or perhaps in sports. Friendless and deeply embarrassed by their emptiness and their woundedness. And Thomas Hart says the average man has learnt it is not okay to express significant parts of his emotional life, in other words, pain, fear, sadness, loneliness or need, and therefore he wears a mask. He is lonely, angry and boring. He does not know how to connect and he has little to say. So a fairly depressing sort of picture which has been painted by some of the commentators with respect to men, and this dis-ease, this uncertainty which has befallen the male part of the species. So what do some commentators have to say about flourishing as a man? If we've got all this set of problems over here, then what are some of the answers, if you like, in terms of flourishing as a man? And Steve Biddulph, in his book called Manhood, said there's 7 steps to manhood. Firstly, men need to have a profound conversation with their fathers. Now, I read that some years ago and I decided, right, I need to have a profound conversation with my father. My dad was not a Christian. He was dying of emphysema, and I thought, I really, you know the story, I really got to give this a crack. I've got to, So I decided, right, I'm going to have this profound conversation with Dad. And so I sat down with him when I was in Auckland at some point and thanked him for all he'd done for me, because in many ways Dad was quite a moral man. I was grateful to him for that. But, and thanked him for, stumping up for my education, etc., and how grateful I was for that. But he saw me coming a mile away. He saw me coming a mile away. And he changed the subject on me, and I knew that was it. I wasn't going to get anywhere with him. And so I regret that, actually. I still live with that. But he was a man of his time. A lot of men were like that, especially those who'd been to war. And Dad had been to war. He never talked about it, except in perhaps his final days, but he never ever talked about it. One of the things I remember him saying at one point was, because he served on the illustrious aircraft carrier, and he was an armourer, so he was on the deck a lot, and it troubled him that these young Japanese pilots were coming in to commit suicide, to the suicide bombers. And that impacted him deeply, but he would never talk about that before. And interestingly, I read a book about Victoria's later, written by a New Zealand author, because there was a near miss on the aircraft carrier, and it was a flight of 3 kamikaze pilots, and one of them went to do the job with his Bible in his lap. Yeah, we don't think about that sort of thing, do we? But anyway, that's just a little aside, that this kamikaze pilot was actually a Christian. So, and did the job with his Bible in his lap. So a profound conversation with your father, if you're able to. Of course, it's a different story if your father's already passed on. Secondly, sexuality. And Steve Biddulph, and I won't expand on this, says, once you've made love, having sex will never do. It's something to think about. Thirdly, and we'll talk about more of this in a minute, is the rediscovery of ritual for men and young men. And being a real father, telling your kids that you love them. And again, some years ago, I emailed Dad. I forget what it was about, but we were in another part of the country, and I put on the bottom, Love David. And he emailed me back, and I read it, and I just about fell off my chair. Do you know why? You know why? Because on the bottom he wrote, Love Dad. It's the first time he'd ever told me he loved me. Now, I knew that he loved me. And I can see from the reaction of some of the older guys here, you understand what I'm talking about here. I knew that he loved me, but he never ever said that he loved me. So that's pretty important. You tell your kids that you actually do love them. Being a real father. And real male friends, not mates. And Steve Biddulph suggests that we need, and work out the acronym here, we need a society for the protection and encouragement of righteous manhood. You worked it out? Yeah, some of you have. Society for the protection and encouragement of righteous manhood. Sixthly, finding a job with a heart. In other words, a job which is significant for you and gives you plenty of rubs and means a lot, rather than a job which is just grinding you down into the earth. And finally, he says, men and women, that men need to relate to their spouses as equals and partners, and not to be a wimp. And when you're faced with your wife's anger, not to be compliant or unhappy and simply submitting and mumbling an apology and tiptoeing away, rather having men who can make decisions at times and let women know when she's not making sense. Now, the other night, Viv and I were out, I'm really getting in here, we were out walking and we were discussing something, and I said, "Oh, Vivian, you've been a snotty-nosed cow." And we both laughed, and we're at that stage in life where we were able to say that, you know. Whereas before, we're going to 3 or 4 day lockdown, and I'd be in silent mode, and she'd be stomping around the house and everything else. You're a snotty-nosed cow. Whereas before, I'd probably get all upset and get in a huff and everything else, and go into lockdown mode. And not treating women, says Steve Biddulph, as saints or as devils. Men can sometimes do that, put the woman up on a pedestal, or either if she falls from that pedestal, then somehow she's grown horns and a tail with a fork on it. What else can be done in terms of flourishing as a man? More Angelette, okay? Rite of the need for ritual and the rite of passage. And C.L. Ashley comments on this as well. Here in New Zealand, she commented on the loss of the rite of passage into manhood and says that sport is really now the only option in terms of rite of passage. Learning to be something bigger than yourselves, something providing structure and balance within a male's life, and being part of something, a team, which just isn't about the individual. And I think that we've lost ground here because we've just resorted to individualised rites of passage. The individual decides what the rite of passage is. Oh, there's getting a licence maybe being able to vote, maybe 21st birthdays, although they don't seem to be. But it's been, what's the rite of passage now? Is it based around alcohol? Is it based around bungee jumping? Is it, what actually is the rite of passage? More Angelette in a man's life on manhood state this: the issue is how to steward and channel power and our other instincts into life-giving and world-giving activities. And Richard Rohr is a well-known Christian commentator in Adam's Return, good book. It is a bad time to be a boy. God is fiercely committed to you and the restoration of your masculine heart. His initiation involves a series of tests and a journey, a shattering of self and of the mask. Men need a mission, a life purpose, and man needs to know his name. Joseph Campbell, it's not up on the slide, indicates that he thinks there are 3 stages in initiation, and he refers to Jonah actually in this. The story of Jonah, the call, and the crisis in the call, and then descending down into the belly of the fish, where the testing takes place, and then the journey afterwards, this sort of 3-staged kind of initiation or invitation to initiation. And Eliade speaks about creating sacred space and kairos and sacred time. And we still do that to some extent. I'd suggest that things like Easter camps actually are sacred space. They are God-created, if you like, environments and times for initiation, so to speak. And I hope we never lose that, really. But things are changing, of course, pretty radically. So, more Angelette and Richard Rohr, speaking particularly about initiation. John Eldridge, the American author, talks about the recovery and releasing of a man's true nature. And he says that men need 3 things. They need a battle to fight, an adventure to live, and a damsel to rescue. That's what we need, guys. A damsel to rescue. I wonder what that looks like. They don't want rescuing, no, quite. Maybe the boot's on the other foot. And then John Lee speaks about the need to recover fatherhood, and he speaks of 4 kinds of defective father. Firstly is the father who would be king. This is the man who works hard all day and returns home to be waited upon. Of course, that never takes place in my house. But the father who returns home and waits to be waited upon, with tea on the table and the slippers in front of the TV and so forth. Secondly, the critical father, says John Lee, full of nitpicking and put-downs, frustrated and angry, and totally involved in the family, but in very negative ways. And then he says there's the passive father, who's relinquished all responsibilities to the wife and to the mother. So he's there, but he's not there really. And then there is the absent father, on the other hand, the capable man, but he's away an awful lot and absorbed in his career. He leaves home early and comes home late. Some of we officers might relate to that a wee bit. He speaks about having a conversation with your father as well and allowing fathers to be fathers. And C.E. Lashley makes this point that especially with the raising of boys, especially when they hit the teenage years, C.E. Lashley and John Lee actually say women need to step back. You need to step back, girls, and let the men step in. Because there's some things about raising boys which men understand. And the woman can be perhaps a wee bit too protective. But actually boys need to find out, sometimes the hard way, but having the father or some other male figure beside them, that the woman need to step back and let the men step up. What else is needed to flourish as a man? Gao Shihi. And this is addressed particularly to those of us who are perhaps in our 50s or nearing retirement or past retirement. And Gail Chihi, she's an American, talks about engagement with second adulthood. What will you do with the second half of your life? That men are confronted with the fear of irrelevance and the question, what has my life actually added up to? And he talks about needing to reinvent yourself, to redirect the hammer redirect your life before the hammer falls, to rediscover your passion areas. Don't retire, redirect. Transition from power and position for men to influence. That's a very important transition. From power and position to influence. To transition from competing to connectivity, to connecting, embracing multiple roles, revising your maps and charts in terms of where you're going, and to nurture creativity. Why? Because we're living longer. And we now have this second adulthood we move into. It wasn't that long ago, the average lifespan for men in New Zealand was 69. Well, now it's well up. It must be nearly 80 now that we can, on average, expect to live. So, and of course we're healthier and everything else, so men are living longer. What are we going to do with the second stage of our lives? George Sweet, who's a retired counsellor and psychotherapist in Christchurch, had this to say. It's not on the screen, I'm sorry. He says, essentialism is nonsense. Men already have a gentle, warm, listening, caring, nurturing and intimate side. Men and women have been culturally conditioned over the centuries, I guess, Industrial Revolution, everything else, and some men are developing their nurturing, intimate side. Others simply become victims, blame the family court, move into multiple relationships without realising it is their issues that they actually need to deal with. And Sweet says that patriarchy has done men no favours. The macho male culture is a fear response to intimacy, of coming second, and of being the gentle man. Another commentator, Bernerges, actually argues that Jesus is the model or exemplar of manhood to be aspired to, and points to the fact that Jesus walked with God, that he was compassionate, that he was courageous, that he was inclusive, that he was visionary, that he was a server, a boundary crosser, he was truthful, he was a releaser of potential, he was life-giving, he gave energy for others, he was a forgiver and a restorer of people, and that he was comfortable in destiny. You worked out who it is? John Boanerges, otherwise known as John Bar Zebedee, the author of the Gospel of John. Okay? And we know that John includes a whole lot of stories which aren't found in the Synoptic Gospels and the other Gospels. The woman caught in adultery. Jesus here is the boundary crosser. Nicodemus, Lazarus, stories related, narratives within the John's Gospel. The life-giving aspect of Jesus being brought out here. The Samaritan woman, the inclusiveness which Jesus is actually showing with the Samaritan woman. And there are some theologians like Brown, who's a Catholic theologian, actually argues that she was given sub-apostolic status, which is why so much attention is given to John with her particular story. The server, the man who's washing the feet, turning water to wine. And I just love the final story which we read in the Gospel of John. When they'd finished eating, Jesus turned to Peter and said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" What were the these? I don't know what the these were. Was it the boats, the family firm, or whatever? Do you love me more than this? And Peter said, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. I'll feed my sheep." And again, the second time, Jesus turned to Peter and said, "Simon, do you truly love me?" And Peter said, "Yes, Lord, you know I love me." "Well then, I know you love me. I love you." And he said, "Well then, feed my lambs." And then a third time he turned to Peter and said, "Simon, son of John, do you truly love me?" And this time Peter was upset because he asked him a third time, and he said, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Take care of my lambs." I tell you the truth, Peter, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and you went where you wanted to go. But when you're older, someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. And by that, John says in editorial comment, by that he indicated the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And then he said to him, "Peter, follow me. Follow me." The forgiver, the restorer, to Peter on the beach, and of course turning around the 3 denials which Peter had earlier made outside the palace where Jesus was being tried. And so to finish with tonight, and then there'll be we'll hand it over to Malcolm because he'll arrange whatever we're going to do then. Some biblical metaphors, really. God in the garden. "Where are you?" was the question. Adam and Eve. "Where are you? Where are you?" And in the book of Proverbs, a bloke's heart, a man's heart, is like a deep pool, it says. And I like to Kiwianise that and say, a deep pool with some mighty big eels in the bottom of it. Where are you? A man's heart is like a deep pool. So, drop the fig leaf, come out from hiding. In the book of Zechariah, we find Joshua the priest being spoken of as being a smouldering stick snatched from the fire. And perhaps we as men could feel like that at times. But then we have the cry to Lazarus, of course, in the tomb, come out, get rid of the grave clothes, come out. And let's seek the still small voice, which Elijah sought when he was running from Jezebel and came to the cave, and God's voice was not in the earthquake or in the fire or in the smashing wind. God's voice was in the still small voice. So men are feeling uncertain, perhaps, are feeling at disease, dis-ease. I don't think it's possible to actually categorise men in New Zealand now. I don't think that's probably a wise thing to do. But there are some things which we can strive towards. I'll leave it to you to sort out whether you think it's an essentialist thing or a cultural thing or both in terms of what constitutes a male. But we have had some sort of guidelines tonight as well from what some of the commentators and perhaps one or two scriptural bits in terms of what they are indicating with respect to what it is to flourish as a man. Thank you.